Good morning, friends. I am here in our church's multi-purpose room. It is 10:40 on Sunday morning. Usually this room's full of confirmation students. It's chaotic, it's loud, it's beautiful. But right now, it is full of tables that have name cards and a buffet line that was all set up for our volunteer appreciation dinner that we had scheduled for Saturday. That was canceled. Just like many things are being canceled right now. We just heard from our governor that schools will be closed starting Wednesday. And I have, like many of you, been struggling to try to find words to put to all the thoughts that have been swirling in my head, not just over the last 24, 48 hours, but the last month as we've seen the progression of COVID across our globe. And so this morning I've just been in my office praying, reading, desperately trying to listen for a word from the Lord, asking that He would give me something, some divine inspired thought to give my community, and really, if I'm being honest, just to give me, so that I may know peace in this time. But as I was sitting and thinking and listening, I realized that God has been preparing me and at the very least our youth community, our middle schoolers and high schoolers, and our volunteers over the last few weeks as we've been talking about anxiety in our high school group on Wednesday nights. And as we have been talking about our biggest emotions on Tuesday nights with our middle schoolers. We talked about disgust 2 weeks ago. We talked about anger last week with our middle schoolers. In high school, we talked about how God doesn't leave us alone in our anxiety, and how God, through Christ, meets us in our boat. And I feel like that's the word that I have for myself, and I feel compelled to share this morning, is that through the person of Christ, we are not left alone in our anxiety. In Mark chapter 6, there's this crazy story where Jesus meets disciples in their anxiety. It says, immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to Bethsaida, where he dismissed the crowd. After leaving them, he went up on the mountainside to pray. Later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he was alone on the land. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Shortly before dawn, he went out to them, walking on the lake. He was about to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out because they all saw him and were terrified. Immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." Then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves and the fishes. Their hearts were hardened. There's a couple things in this story that I think speak to where a lot of us find ourselves today. In verse 47 in Mark chapter 6, it says, later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and Jesus was alone on land. So already the scene is set at nighttime. It is dark. The disciples are not near Jesus. And then it says, Jesus saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. I don't know about you, but that feels like an apt description of the billowing amounts of news, precaution, concern, and at times hysteria around the current situation. And we're trying to be faithful. We're trying to be wise. As parents, we're trying to think about what's best for our kids, our jobs, and the multiple responsibilities we have as college students, trying to figure out where do my responsibilities lie? With school canceled, do I go back to campus? Do I stay at home? How do we navigate this space? How do we adjust to new circumstances? And I don't know anybody who's out here trying to just throw caution to the wind and live recklessly for reckless sake. But we're all trying to keep moving forward, but the winds keep pushing, right? And what I love about this is it says, he saw his disciples straining at the oars. Now, geographically, if Jesus is sitting on a mountainside, and his disciples are in the sea, let's say they're in the middle of the sea. They are miles from Jesus, and it is nighttime, and there's a storm. There's so much in the way. There's so much distance. There's so much circumstance. There's so much storm that it's very plausible, it would be expected that Jesus would not see them. But I want us to remember that despite the circumstance, despite how dark it seems, despite how far it might feel that we are from community, from Christ, from the person of Jesus in this time of uncertainty, he sees you. He sees us straining. And what I love is that it doesn't end there. It's not just the story about like, hey, Jesus sees you. Now keep up the good work. It says he saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Shortly before dawn, he went out to them walking on the lake. See, Jesus, he came to them. In their straining, in their attempts to keep pushing forward, Jesus came to them. And he didn't just come in a way that they were expecting. He didn't come down, find a boat, start paddling the boat, and come out and pull up alongside them. No, Jesus showed up in a way that was completely unexpected to them. He walked on the water. The water and the winds, which were making it difficult for the disciples to move forward, were the very matters in which Jesus walked on top of. Just hear that. Can we hear that? The things that keep us, that are limiting us, our fears, our anxieties, our uncertainties, and particularly maybe even those of other people within our own homes, within our neighborhoods, within our news feeds. Jesus walks above those with confidence. But it's not how we would expect it, right? It says he was about to walk by them, but when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out because they all saw him and were terrified. I had a middle schooler ask me why were they terrified when they saw Jesus? Like, didn't they know who he was? Which is a great question. If you saw Jesus, why would you be terrified? Wouldn't you think like, oh my gosh, he's here, this is great? But they had no reason to believe that Jesus could or would walk on water. Like they were still piecing together this idea of who Jesus was and what he was about and why he had come. And they didn't have a full picture of who Jesus was and what he was capable of. And we are in the same position, regardless of how long you've been following Jesus, regardless of how long you've been investigating Jesus, we still don't have a complete or full picture of who he is or what he can do in our troubled circumstances. In the midst of our anxiety, we do not have a full picture of how he's able to walk above it. And so in these next few weeks, don't be surprised that you will be surprised in the ways that you see Jesus. Keep looking for him. And then lastly, in their terror, adding terror on top of anxiety, adding terror on top of the strain and the struggle, Jesus immediately spoke to them and said, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid. Jesus is with us. Jesus is with you. In our straining, in our attempts to be wise in the ways that we contain ourselves, protect the most vulnerable around us, Jesus is with us. And we need to be people who remind our neighbors of this truth. That we will not be ruled by fear. That Jesus gets in the boat with us. And that we do not need to be afraid. So, over these next couple weeks, as we try to stay connected in the midst of social isolation, remember the most vulnerable around us. Remember those who may not have a spouse in their home with them, who may not have a full home of family. Our college students, our single adults, our older adults, people who being home means being alone. Let's remember them. And if we cannot visit them, we can call them. We can FaceTime. We can send them notes and show up for each other and remind each other to take courage. Jesus is here. Do not be afraid. On Tuesday nights, we keep saying, God is big enough to handle our biggest emotions. And so whatever emotions you're feeling today, tomorrow, later in the week, bring them and trust them to Jesus. He is big enough to handle our biggest emotions. And however long we're in this season, and however long we need to be creative in our connection, I pray that this is a time where we are discovering Jesus walking above our anxiety, walking through our storms in ways that completely surprise us and maybe even terrify us, because we did not know that our God was as big as he shows himself to us over these next few weeks. All right, family, we're praying for you. We love you. I'm with you in this. Text me, call me, and let's just try to stay connected during this time where we're trying to be responsible with our actions. All right, I'm out of here. Have a great rest of your day.